Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Ali Joaquin, a product designer here at Livefront, and today I want to talk to you about mobile app accessibility. To kick us off, I wanted to address two questions I often hear when working with teams on digital products. The first typically comes right after receiving approval for a new project. You'll hear something like, do we have an accessibility checklist to follow? We want to make sure we provide enough scope to cover it. The second often comes right after the big deadline approaches. You may hear, let's ship this first and put accessibility concerns on the roadmap for later. We'll come back to it. Now, I'm sure you might have heard one of these or maybe both. You might have even uttered it yourself once or twice. But my hope is that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to identify the flaws in these statements and learn how to be a better advocate for mobile app accessibility by making accessibility a forethought rather than an afterthought in your practice. Today, we're going to cover a number of areas on accessibility, but I wanted to start off first by defining accessibility together. Then we'll dig into the specifics around mobile accessibility and provide a few examples. And then I'll leave you with a handful of tangible next steps for your team to get started in adapting your product with accessibility requirements. So, without further ado, let's get started. What does it mean to be accessible? By definition, accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. More specifically, so that those people can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, as well as contribute to it. This comes from the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C for short. If you've never heard of them before, they're an international community that develops open standards for all to ensure the long-term growth of the web. The standards that they curate evolve over time, just as the digital space does, and are adopted by digital properties all over. These standards are known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. The purpose of WCAG is to provide product creators with guidelines that help influence digital products to be perceivable, operable, and understandable. Perceivable ensures that information is presented to users in ways that can be recognized. Operable makes sure interface components are navigable and users can perform intended operations. And understandable promises that communicated information and utility is explicitly presented and expressed to users. If this doesn't make a ton of sense to you yet, that's totally fine. We'll get into it a little bit later here. But I do want to add to the complexity a little bit more because there's one more thing you need to know about WCAG. WCAG also provides various levels of accessibility compliance in which your product might fall. The first is level A, essential. This is the minimum that they recognize. The next is level AA, or ideal. This one is the most widely accepted across the board. And the third and final is level AAA, specialized. This one has the most strict compliance levels. While all three of these are mentioned throughout WCAG, the majority of digital platforms abide by these two, AA and AAA, where again, AA is the one that is most rarely used, but you may find yourself dipping into that AAA on occasion under certain circumstances, especially in select industries like healthcare. Now that we have a foundational understanding of accessibility, let's look at mobile accessibility specifically. What is mobile accessibility? If we went back and looked through all of the slides we looked at earlier, there's one thing you may have noticed, or maybe not, that was repeated over and over again, and that is web. Sadly, WCAG only accounts for web accessibility guidelines, but not mobile, and definitely not native mobile. So where does that leave us on mobile then? We're pretty much left to our own accords. It's up to us to define what mobile accessibility means. Here at Livefront, we specialize in designing and building digital products for our partners, and we take accessibility very seriously. You'll even find this ingrained in our company tenets, one of which reads, "We believe equal access to digital products, regardless of ability, disability, or circumstance, is essential." While I can provide a beautiful, legally defensible body of work specific to mobile accessibility that's written by Livefront, I can fill you in on how we might go about figuring out what makes a mobile app accessible. We start by asking ourselves two main questions. First, we ask, is there a comparable native feature that provides the same outcome or intent defined in WCAG? And if not, we ask a second question. How would a user with disabilities want to use our product? When it comes down to it, accessibility is all about paying close attention to user experience. Falling back on this second question will most often push you in the right direction. Given these two questions and the subjectivity of mobile accessibility, we created guidelines that are more so inspired by WCAG rather than word-for-word verbatim. If we looked at the core accessibility features available on iOS and Android devices and categorized them according to our three main WCAG categories, we would end up with something like this. When navigating perceivability, you're going to turn to dynamic type, device orientation, and color contrast. When accounting for operability, you are looking at voice narration, timing adjustments, focus order, keyboard compatibility, and touch targets. And finally, understandability criteria will be mapped to localization, error identification, consistent navigation, and error prevention. I could probably give a lengthy talk on each one of these, but for today, let's focus on just four: dynamic type, color contrast, voice narration, and touch targets. That way we can see how WCAG standards sometimes map directly to native features, while others may be more vague and up for interpretation. The first area we'll look at is voice narration. Voice narration allows everything shown on any given screen to be read aloud to users so that they can use a digital property without relying on seeing the screen. Voice narration not only benefits users who may be blind or have low vision, but also those who might have dyslexia or other cognitive and learning disabilities. If you were to look at WCAG standards for voice narration, you'd not only be looking at one reference, but multiple that fit under that one umbrella. When interpreting this down for mobile, you would come to realize that native platforms like iOS and Android do a little bit of the background lift for you. However, you're still going to need to do some manual adjustments and ensure that all elements are properly grouped, named, and labeled, as well as interpreted for your audience so that it can be read correctly. Voice narration on iOS is known as VoiceOver, which can be configured from an accessibility menu in device settings. When this feature is turned on,
VoiceOver on, settings, accessibility, back, button.
You will immediately be immersed into the VoiceOver experience and begin to hear how VoiceOver announces visual elements on the screen. For each of our four practice areas today, I'm going to be using a product that is close to my heart, the BoxTops for Education mobile app. And to make it a little easier, I'll be using a single screen from the BoxTops app, the home screen. For VoiceOver specifically, the one thing that may not be obvious is how a user would navigate from one item to another. There are many native gestures that are used, but the one you need to know for this exercise is that swiping from left to right is how our user would go about navigating down the screen and travel from item to item. You will see this expressed on the screen between each narration as I go through. Now listen carefully as we navigate down the home screen of the BoxTops app to experience VoiceOver in action.
You've earned $53.40 for schools. My earnings, button.
You'll notice here, we're consciously choosing to group the larger text label with the action button to read it as one group. This helps users understand that these two units go together. By default, a user would have to swipe through each independently.
Account settings, new messages available, button. Lindale Community School has earned $421.10 out of $500 for the July 2020 to June 2021 school year. Earn for your school. Every BoxTops counts. Button. Open school earnings details. More actions available.
This one too warrants some explanation. You might have guessed it, but by default, a user would need to individually swipe through each string of text on here. But if you think about it, that might actually cause more confusion. If we group all of these elements together as one and configure it to be read as one, we are able to better articulate the information that is being visually represented on the screen.
Explore, heading. Bonus offers, button. What's new, button. Featured, heading. Just for you, earn one bonus BoxTops on YoPlay single-serve cups when you buy any 5 participating YoPlay single-serve products starting on June 12, 2020. Learn more, button.
Similar to the others we've paused on, the featured card here also makes much more sense when read as one rather than individual strings of text. Otherwise, it may be difficult for a user to know what that Learn More button actually refers to.
Tab bar, selected. Home tab, 1 of 3. Scan tab, 2 of 3. Products tab, 3 of 3.
Next up, we have Dynamic Type. Dynamic Type gives users the ability to shrink and enlarge text shown on any given screen in a native mobile experience. This too benefits users who may be blind or have low vision, as well as those with dyslexia or other cognitive and learning disabilities. Looking at WCAG as our starting point, you will see that Dynamic Type doesn't seem all that too complex. And when interpreted for mobile, things don't get too crazy there either. But that's because a lot of details can be encapsulated underneath this very wide umbrella. The bottom line is this: a best effort should be made to ensure that all content supports scaling up to the maximum size allowed by the OS. Why? If you put yourself in those users' shoes, they're probably shrinking and enlarging their text for good reason, so we should be doing everything we can to ensure our product is adapting to that. Dynamic Type is another feature that's configurable at a device level. By default on iOS, users are provided with 7 typed sizes. However, when the larger accessibilities toggle shown at the top here is turned on, you not only get those 7 by default, but you also unlock 5 additional sizes. That means you must design and develop for a grand total of 12 type sizes for every screen in your mobile app on iOS alone. Let's take a look at the Boxtop's home screen again to help bring this to light. When designing for variable type sizes, you typically start with default at 100%, which looks like this. But it's not as simple as designing one screen and calling it a day. You need to design with scalability in mind and create scaling rules to be followed for the rest of the text sizes available on the device. Here's what the home screen would look like at the largest dynamic text size, extra, extra, extra large, at 135%. You'll notice that not a lot is changing other than the elements becoming larger. But I want you to pay close attention to this white school card towards the top of the screen as I transition to the next screen. As we breach into those additional 5 larger accessibility sizes, you'll notice that the design shifts to better accommodate certain components. For example, this school card gets completely turned around and vertically stacks all of the elements to better leverage the available horizontal real estate. This is another conscious design choice made to better account for screen real estate. If design did not interfere, the school illustration and copy would have collided with each other and become completely illegible. So this is what the smallest larger accessibility size looks like at AX1, and this is what it looks like at the largest, AX5. You can definitely see why we adjusted that school card here. Next up, we have color contrast. Color contrast looks at the visible relationship between 2 colors that are placed on top of each other in the user interface. For example, take a look at the text on this screen. The navy text is placed on a white background. Those 2 colors, navy and white, would be required to either meet or exceed a certain level of contrast in order to be considered a legible element. Color contrast standards are extremely important for folks that may be partially blind, but also older folks that suffer from low contrast sensitivity. Looking at WCAG as our guide, we are met with quite a bit of information at both AA and AAA compliance levels. And when we narrow this down for mobile specifically, it doesn't get all that much more simple. This is because mobile and web have a very similar view on what color contrast ratios may pass or fail. Here are the 2 biggest pieces of information you'll need to know for today though. Small text must meet a minimum ratio of 4.5 to 1 in AA or 7 to 1 in AAA, while large text and icons must meet a minimum ratio of 3 to 1 in both. Let's take another look at the Boxtop's home screen for this one. As this slide builds out, you'll start to see that every element on the screen must pass the appropriate color contrast ratios based on the various color combinations used. When designed correctly, a lot of this can be done upstream when building the design system, but ratios should always be checked along the way, just in case you add new features or different color combinations. And last but not least, we have touch target sizes. This one may seem a bit mundane, but it's actually crucial when designing and developing for mobile applications. Touch target sizes reference the tappable area surrounding any navigable element on the screen. If you've ever encountered a specific button, let's say an info icon for example, and you find it difficult to tap, this is most likely due to an ill-sized touch target. With WCAG as our guide, you'll notice this one is actually categorized as level AAA compliance. But remember, WCAG is built for web accessibility. On mobile, we're using our thumbs and fingers, which come in a variety of sizes, so we need to make sure that our mobile application is navigable. When this is interpreted for mobile, we once again lean on iOS and Android as our guide, since touch target sizes are very specific to device and OS. On iOS, all touch targets must meet a minimum of 44 square points, while on Android, we have a minimum of 48. I've highlighted a few of these in the Box Tops app. We'll start at the top and work our way down. The first one here we'll look at is the profile icon in the upper right. As you can see, this one is set to the default 44 by 44, but you'll quickly see that we need to customize as we move forward. You'll notice the visual element of the My Earnings button is actually shorter than the recommended 44. Sometimes the visual design warrants smaller than 44-point action items, but that doesn't mean you need to compromise the touch size itself. You'll often see that touch target sizes exceed the bounds of visual extremities. This school card is much larger than the minimum requirement, but one additional item I do want to call out here is that sometimes touch sizes vary depending on the device dimensions. For example, this card is pinned to the left and right sides, so if a device is skinnier or wider, that card would increase or shrink. The bonus offers and what's new cards are also much larger than the minimum or what you might have thought they were originally. The last item I wanted to highlight was the navigation bar here at the bottom. We probably could have gotten away with using 44 by 44, but we wanted to increase those to 66 given that this serves as the app's core navigation. As you can see, there are a lot of considerations to be made around each of these areas called out in WCAG, and these four barely even scratch the surface. But hopefully this helps you see just how important accessibility is on mobile. The last topic I'm going to cover today is a bit more actionable. How can you and your team better account for accessibility? As you saw with the two guiding questions I reviewed earlier, it's all about distilling down information. So how are we going to distill all of this information into a formalized practice? The first step is to acknowledge that most teams that care about accessibility are structured in a way like this, where it starts with developers who receive a ticket and are simply asked to make this feature accessible. They'll do the best to their abilities and pass it along to QA when the work is done. QA is likely to see a fragmented experience or run into a unique edge case, and that's where designers come in. They'll have to be looped in to put a band-aid on the problem. At Livefront, we've re-architected this process to put designers in the front seat. When features are designed with accessibility in mind, it takes the guesswork out of the process and eliminates those fragmented or lapsed experiences. Apart from rethinking your process, I have a few other areas you can look at to really hit the ground running with accessibility. First up is exploring WCAG. It may be obvious, but jump onto w3.org and get familiar with the web guidelines. Learn to speak the language and learn the unique terminology. Map the WCAG criteria to your specific mobile accessibility features. And don't forget to advocate for these standards and address accessibility topics and questions as they come up so that it becomes commonplace in as many meetings as possible. Next, focus on building empathy with your users. Jump into the settings on your phone and experience these features firsthand. Turn on VoiceOver on iOS or TalkBack on Android for an extended period of time and see how you can do. Invert the colors on your device, or maybe even pair a Bluetooth keyboard to your phone. Experiencing how someone who is solely reliant on these bits of technology is truly eye-opening. Third, audit your product. There are some great free resources out there that use mobile terminology and provide compliance audit outlines to help you understand where you measure up. Do this on a regular basis and set up a calendar reminder if you need to, so that you can ensure you are getting this done at the very least annually, if not more frequently. And lastly, evaluate your process and approach. If you are just starting out on a new project, you're in a little bit of an easier spot. Define accessibility traits right away during design so that accessibility becomes simply requirements rather than afterthoughts. For existing products, pick the worst room in your house and make it your favorite. Pick a feature or a screen that needs the most love and get started, and become familiar with what your team needs to deliver and go from there. Okay, that's everything I have for you today. Hopefully you're starting to see just how important mobile accessibility is. Thank you so much for joining me. I will leave you with one other piece of information. I put together this one-sheeter based on the 4 areas that we outlined and where you can get started. So go ahead and take this back to your team and get started today. Thank you.